Hi, I'm Dr. Ellie Anderson, philosophy professor and co-host of Overthink podcast. I'm introducing today an idea that comes up in the work of Kierkegaard about the three spheres or stages of existence. And I'm using the book that I teach in my existentialism class, The Essential Kierkegaard. This shows up on page 182. Kierkegaard, or I should say specifically, a pseudonym, but we don't even know which pseudonym. If you've read Kierkegaard before, you will know that Kierkegaard tends to write in pseudonyms. He has these various characters, and he writes from their perspectives in different works. The book from which I am drawing is called Stages on Life's Way, and it is studies by various persons, compiled, forwarded to the press, and published by Hilarious Bookbinder. So we don't even know which person wrote this, because Kierkegaard says that it was compiled by Hilarious Bookbinder. So I'm going to just say Kierkegaard here for shorthand. I know some scholars of Kierkegaard might take issue with that, but I think it's going to be the easiest. This is really the author function as it's appearing in this book, I think, rather than the unnamed pseudonym, the work of which Hilarious Bookbinder, Kierkegaard's pseudonym, is compiling. Bookbinder starts by having a preface and a letter to the reader. And Bookbinder's letter to the reader spells out these three spheres for which Kierkegaard is really well known, and which I think help to situate a lot of the rest of his work, even though not everything's always going to map on super neatly. Bookbinder here says that there are three spheres of existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. Now, what are these different spheres? The first sphere, the aesthetic, is described as the sphere of immediacy. In the aesthetic sphere, we are immersed in sense perception and imagination. We also have a limited individual perspective, that of the ego, in the aesthetic sphere. I'm focused on what is directly around me here. I'm focused, for instance, on the flavor of a taco that I am eating. It has a savory element. It has a spicy element. It's delicious. Maybe there's a little sweetness depending on what type of salsa that's on there. I am completely caught up in my own experience of tasting this taco. I love tacos. Now, you might respond, I'm not a big fan of tacos. Okay, whatever. I'm in the aesthetic sphere. I don't care. I'm focused on myself as an individual. The second sphere that Bookbinder articulates is the ethical. The ethical sphere he describes is the sphere of requirement. We've moved in the ethical sphere from the individual to the universal. This is the domain of communication, language, and understanding. Not only what we would consider ethics in the sense of morality, but also what in German, Hegel, who is an influence on Kierkegaard is writing in Danish, but he's influenced by Hegel writing in German, would call Sittlichkeit, which is just the whole domain of mores, norms, etc. of our society. The ethical sphere is mediated. So here I'm going to tell you, I'm into tacos, and you're going to say, I'm not. And I'm going to ask you for reasons why you're not into tacos. I may try and convince you that you should be interested in tacos, why you should think that they're delicious. The ethical involves the universal perspective of laws, rules, norms, and sort of social structures in general. And the ethical sphere is where tensions emerge between competing value systems. So we might argue about why I'm right about tacos and why you're wrong and the tacos are delicious. We're going to have a tension there because you're going to disagree with me. And the tension that emerges in terms of the sphere of the ethical in one of Kierkegaard's other works, Fear and Trembling, is that of Abraham's decision to kill his son Isaac because God told him to. I have another video on that if you want to check it out, a video on Kierkegaard on faith. And in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard's pseudonym, Johannes de Silencio, says that Abraham's decision to kill his son Isaac doesn't make any sense from the sphere of the ethical. Abraham couldn't try and convince his wife or somebody else in his community that his decision to kill his son is right. They're going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? If right now you're like, what the hell is she talking about? Because you don't know the example that I'm familiar with, check out that part of Fear and Trembling and perhaps use my video as an introduction to it. This experience of Abraham doesn't make sense from the perspective of the ethical, but this leads us to the third sphere, which is the sphere of the religious. And this sphere is described as the sphere of fulfillment. If in the aesthetic we had an emphasis on the individual, and in the ethical we had an emphasis on the universal, it's the religious that is going to bring the individual and the universal together. It's a synthesis between them. This is the domain of faith. And it's paradoxical because the individual and the universal are in tension. Their synthesis is a really uneasy one. The paradox, according to this third sphere in Kierkegaard's work, is that the single individual is actually higher than the universal. So in the case of Abraham, Abraham transcends the ethical sphere through his individual relation to God. And Kierkegaard, as a Christian philosopher, uses the paradox of Jesus Christ as an example. In Christian theology, Christ is God made flesh. And so Jesus is a particular human being, but is also the universal, God, in this sort of weird paradox. And the individual, Jesus, is higher than the universal through sacrificing himself for the good of humanity. Now, to say that the religious sphere is the sphere of faith sometimes turns students off if you don't have a religious background. But I want you to think about the philosophical meaning of what is being said here, whether or not you are religious. What does it mean that there is this subjective component, this component of faith that goes into every decision that we make for Kierkegaard, and that we need to properly acknowledge Abraham's existence in the sphere of the religious is what makes him a knight of faith rather than a tragic hero. That terminology, knight of faith, tragic hero, comes again from Fear and Trembling. The tragic hero is caught in the ethical sphere, whereas the knight of faith is the one who makes the leap into the religious sphere. And so you can already see in the way that I've moved from talking about stages of life's way to talking about Fear and Trembling that the articulation of the three spheres that comes up on page 182 of The Reader through this letter to the reader from Hilarious Bookbinder helps to situate a variety of Kierkegaard's other works. I've mentioned Fear and Trembling, but there are other ones to which it relates as well, including Either Or. The either section of Either Or is all about the aesthetic sphere. And ultimately, these are not only spheres, but he also says stages. So the religious, by virtue of synthesizing components from the ethical and the aesthetic, is the highest sphere. And the paradox is that the internal, which is really encapsulated by the sphere of the religious, the third sphere, is higher than the external, in addition to the individual being higher than the universal.